Hello and welcome to University of Houston Libraries and Special Collections. Thank you for joining us today. March is Women's History Month, and this year we would like to welcome Nancy Sims to discuss her collection here at the University of Houston, her career, her professional personal experiences, and her thoughts and hopes for the future. A native Texan, Nancy Sims is a parent, a public relation professional, professor, and pundit. Nancy has worked on numerous political campaigns and has been teaching Women in Politics course at the University of Houston for nearly 20 years. As the Senior Vice President of Pierpont Communications and now the owner of her own firm, Nancy Sims LLC, she guides her clients from energy companies to top retailers on areas of reputation management, crisis communications, government relations, and much more. She holds a bachelor's degree in politics from Sam Houston State University and a master's degree in political science and women's studies from University of St. Thomas. Nancy, thank you so much for being here with us, and happy Women's History Month.
Thank you so much. Of course, I call it Women's Her Story Month.
Of course.
Her story.
Of course.
Of which we have way too little of in
Absolutely.
our historical learnings.
Absolutely agreed. For our viewers who want to know a little bit more about you and your work, can you tell us a little more about your background and what is it that you like to do?
Well, sure. I'm one of those people that came to planet Earth with a pretty clear head of what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. Apparently, I was news addicted at a very young age, which was a problem because it was during the Vietnam War. And my parents didn't want me to watch the news, so they would send me to bed. And back in those days, we had big black and white console TVs. It was like a piece of furniture TV, not like wall art like it is today. and they would put me to bed, and I would sneak down the hall and watch the news after they tried to put me to bed. So I just kind of came with a very focused idea of what I wanted to do. And when I was 13, the Watergate hearings started. And those hearings really influenced me towards politics. Mm-hmm. And the opportunity to see Barbara Jordan defend the Constitution. She was a congresswoman from Texas, African American. And first I loved that she was Texas because my world was limited. We didn't have the internet when I was young. So as my daughter liked to says, you're older than the internet. And I always said, honey, I'm older than the PC. You know? But it is true. And you know, we didn't have the global perspectives that people have today. So our worlds were fairly limited. As I used to say of Walter Cronkite, who was a newscaster back when we had 3 stations, if he said it, it was the gospel, you know, because that's who my parents watched. So, you know, I was very interested, and I became interested in politics. By the 8th grade, I decided to write a paper on how a woman might become the first president. Mm-hmm. And so I did that, and then I began volunteering in my state rep's office when I was about 16, 17. And to write that paper in the 8th grade, I went and met my state rep, met the senator, and they were so shocked that a young person would have interest. At the time, I didn't know how weird I was, but now I do. If a young person that young takes an interest. I mean, they were really patting me on the head, but, you know, the fact is I met them, and I got to work with them and volunteered with them, and they boosted my career as I went on through the years. So there's a great picture here at the end. Should I show you?
Sure.
This is where my high school friends and I skipped school during our senior year because it was the Texas legislature was in session. Oh. And I spurred this whole thing on, and of course my mom knew that we were going. But, you know, the suburb where I grew up was like a small town, and very blue collar, North Shore and Galena Park. And boy, you have to love these 70s fashions, huh?
Oh, yeah.
And so we skipped school and drove to Austin to go see the legislature and in our senior year of high school. And it was great. And Senator Williams and Rep. Palumbo, who were our neighborhood elected officials, got the biggest kick out of it. So they both took pictures and submitted it to the it was called the Sentinel. It was the neighborhood newspaper,
Right.
which means that we got clearly caught skipping school. But this is really one of the earliest, things where we went and met our elected officials, and, still friends with most of these people today.
That's great. So you skipped school to go see a representative, not
Well,
really to go
Texas legislature
to the
only
movies or anything.
No.
Just, it was important to go meet your legislators.
Well, and we just wandered into their offices. We didn't mean to see them, actually. We sure didn't mean to get our picture in the paper. But
well, that's great. It looks like you guys had a really, really good time.
And so, yeah, from there, I just went on and majored in political science and planned to get a teaching degree, because that's what women did in the late 70s. You got a teaching degree. And I got the opportunity to intern in Congress in Washington. And there I learned I didn't have to be a teacher, that women could actually work in politics professionally. And even my college wasn't fully there at that point. In fact, they would give me a lot of grief. And every time I'd go to meet with the dean about not the dean, the department chair, about my graduation plan, he would say, "When are you going to do your student teaching?" And I'd say, "I'm not. I don't have to be a teacher." But there were only 3 girls in the department at the time, no female professors of any kind, and I was the only one not getting a teaching degree.
Wow. So
they gave me a lot of grief, but I gave them a lot of grief back. So that's why you see a lot of this fun stuff from my college days. And then I just went on, and also I went through college in 3 years, because when you're 20, a presidential election every 4 years sounds like it's 100 years away.
Sure.
And so I wanted to get out in time to work on a presidential election.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Which I did do. I got out in time to work for Jimmy Carter, and of course he lost, which ended my D.C. dreams. Because my local congressman that I had interned for lost too. It was a big, it was one of the first years Texas began to defeat longtime Democrats.
I gotcha.
In 1980.
Well, that actually brings us to my next question. You began your career as a political consultant in a time when women were not traditionally involved or even welcome in this line of work. You talked a little bit about what inspired you to get into this line of work, but what obstacles did you face, and how did you overcome them?
So I would say, actually, I began my life as a staffer. Okay, so I worked for elected officials. I worked for the Steelworkers Union as an organizer. I worked on the staff of a state rep for several years, on the staff of Mayor Kathy Whitmire, who was one of the top women mayors at the time. And I had a good experience being a staffer, but I worked on campaigns in between the legislative sessions. And so I was doing both. I was hopping here and hopping there and hopping here and hopping there. And one day, my friend in the mayor's office, I was on the city hall staff, which I didn't do for very long, but went for 2 years with Mayor Whitmire. And I was bemoaning the state of the political consulting industry in Houston. And there were these 2 white gentlemen, that were very prominent and that everybody hired on the Democratic side. I was Democratic initially. And my friend says to me, "You're smarter than those guys. Why don't you just go do it?" So with a 2-week paycheck and gumption, I got up and quit the mayor's office and said, "I'm going to be a political consultant." Even Kathy laughed at me, the mayor at the time. She laughed at me. She was like, "Well, if it does work out, you could always come back to City Hall."
It's good to have some safety net, I suppose.
And so, I spent the first few months doing fundraising, because that's what girls do in campaigns very often. And I one day, Mickey Leland, who was a very famous member of Congress from Houston, was killed in a plane crash. And his death sparked an opening and a whole, what I like to call a domino effect in elected official positions as people moved around to take his seat and then who might take the senator's seat. And, it created this whole effect of a row of dominoes falling. And so this woman called me up, and her name was Sheila Jackson Lee. And she says, I'm going to run for city council, and none of those guys will work for me. So if you really want to be a political consultant, will you come help me? And I said, yes, ma'am. I'll do whatever you need.
That's great.
Except take calls at 2 a.m. So we elected her to city council, and that really kind of kicked off my practice. In the first few years, I specialized in electing women, which were really just coming into the spectrum of getting elected in Houston. And I would say to you that the challenges occurred when for example, there was one union printer in Houston, one big union printer. And if you were on the Democratic side of the aisle, you had to use a union printer. And so the better my business got, the more challenges I faced. So as I set out to I called him up to do a print job, and I always would take a bottle of scotch. This is old days. We didn't have computers. We didn't send the PDF over to the printer. This is a whole different world. You had to go, persuade to make sure your print job was the first in the line and that sort of thing if you were going to make
bottle of
with
scotch.
your deadline. So I went over with my bottle of scotch, and I'd known this guy since I was 18, and he said, I can't do your printing anymore. And I said, what? Fred, what? And he says, no, the other 2 consultants told me they'd pull all my business if I didn't quit printing for you. And I was just dumbfounded. I was like, but you're the only one. Who am I supposed to go to? So it gives me the name of somebody in Pasadena. Well, as luck would have it, about a month or 2 later, I met this incredible young African-American woman that had a print shop. And I said, well, are you unionized? She goes, no, but do you want me to be? And I said, yes. Would you? And of course, I helped her grow her business. But I always was first up because I was top priority. And she started in an old house over by the museum, and then, wound up taking over a warehouse, making millions, because we also helped her get, MWBE contracts and that sort of thing. So it was very exciting to watch her grow. And then they did the same thing to me on television. So as my clients grew, and the people were the kind that needed television ads, political media, especially back then, was very specialized. And so they told the people that did it in Texas not to work with me. The same 2 guys. And so, I'd whine a little. And so one day, as luck would have it, this man knocks on our door. Our office was in an old house on Winburn Street. And it had a nice front porch. The house was built in 1912. And it was just gorgeous. And our clients loved it. We loved it. Everybody loved it. This guy knocks on our door. And he says, hey, what do y'all do? And they said they were our new neighbors. And we said, well, we're political consultants. And I said, what do you do? And he says, I'm film and TV and video. I was like, what? Come in, here's beer, let's talk. And he was Latino. So we built business together. And he became huge and still does DP for movies and all kinds of things. And so where's the Pollie? Oh, there's the Pollie Award.
This one.
In the political world, you have your own version of the Oscars. Okay. And so there's an American Association of Political Consultants, still about 90% white male today.
Wow.
And but they hold every year a campaign ad competition, right? And so it's not the Oscars, but it's called the Pollies. Okay, and so Rod and I, Rod Rodriguez, who was the DP, we made a political ad that won first place TV ad 30 seconds or less political party committee. So we won that together, and it was huge.
Oh, yeah.
And that was just, and the even better thing was, so only one other political consultant in Houston had won a Pollie, and he was on the Republican side.
Oh, wow.
And so I called the political reporter. We used to have those at the Chronicle. And I said, you wrote about Blakemore when he won his Pollie, so now you have to write about us.
Of course.
Because
It's only
won
fair,
our Pollie,
yeah.
and our Pollie's bigger than what his was. So, because it was best political party ad in the nation.
Wow.
And so they did. They wrote a nice big article about it, and that was so exciting.
That's awesome.
So, just to show you that every time they'd try to bring us down, which was constant, and they would succeed in causing me to limp periodically. But then we'd recover. We went through the same thing with direct mail and other tools that we used, because they didn't want, I don't know, they were a little threatened. The other thing about my business was I formed it, and within a year I brought in a young Latina out of UT to work with me. And then also, even as she was coming on, an African-American man whose name was Keith Wade. And Keith was our first African-American president of the student government here at U of H. And he passed recently, and we all did a lot of talking about that. But he came in with me as well. So there was me, Keith, and her name was Olga Rodriguez. And so it was her sister that encouraged me to go out and start my own business, Rita Rodriguez. Oh. And so Olga, Keith, and I, were the only people of color and women in the business. And it was really threatening to people. And we treated how you accessed minority vote differently than the way it had always been done. We wouldn't pay off some of the people that required payoffs historically, and we just played differently. And the fact that we played differently bothered people because we were changing the systems. Of course, had they seen down the road to what was coming, I don't think they would have been as shocked. But we hadn't at that point yet learned to adapt to change so quickly.
Gotcha.
You remember, we're still barely on computers at this point.
Right. So how have things changed for women in public relations or political consulting in the last 20 or so years?
Oh, that's interesting. So for women in political campaigns, you do see much more leadership from women now. But I still think, as I mentioned, the American Association of Political Consultants is still about 90% white males. So, it's still very much a man's game. And this is something I always mention in talking about women in campaigns, is even the language of the campaign world is very male dominant. So, we're at war, you have a war room, you're moving the chess pieces on the game board, just all of the language. It's also very full of cuss words. Anybody in politics, has a potty mouth, doesn't matter what side of the aisle they're on. And we've seen even some of our elected officials slip up, right? Even today. So that's just because politics itself is full of people who cuss like sailors. So it's just a little more rough and tumble game. So you have fewer women. We are seeing more women emerge, but it's still rare for someone, to have a woman strategist. Strategy is where the void comes. Women are very popular in the scheduling function. They're very popular in the fundraising function, or as volunteer coordinators, or as I like to say, the caretaker roles. But when you get down to the strategy, who's going to write the campaign plan, who's going to develop the messaging, that you tend to see, the higher that level of campaign action goes, the fewer
Still.
women you see.
Yeah. So there's still a bit of a.
It's still got a dichotomy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I gotcha.
Definitely. Now, when you talk about public relations, you're talking about the corporate world.
Mm-hmm.
So while women are very popular in the spokesperson roles and the marketing, branding,
Sure.
that kind of stuff, you see women do well. When you begin to look at overall direction of branding a company, guiding an IPO,
strategy type.
a
things.
again, strategic level of thinking, you see fewer women.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Although it's an industry so female dominated.
Very interesting. Is there a memorable experience or a particular campaign that kind of stuck in your memory?
There's so many campaigns.
Sure.
I mean, I worked on over, between my consulting business, which ran for 15 years, and my early years in campaigns, there's so many. But I think some of my proudest work, one of the things we made as a mission statement, our business was called Quantum Consultants.
Mm-hmm.
And our business cards said redefining the science of politics. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that had personally put me on the map is even before computers, I would get these huge Harris County wall maps, and I'd get the census data. I am a total geek. I'm still a total geek. And I love voting behavior, voter analysis, and data that applies to that. And I guess if you were to ask one of the candidates or somebody that I worked with, they would tell you it was always Nancy's insight to the voters that made her different. And so I think I would overlay census data, and I read data magazines. This was before data was a part of our life. Daily life. Like now I can Google anything and find it. But I mean, I would read what TV shows people were watching, and I'd study and analyze so I could build a profile of the voters. So I was doing this at 22, 23 years old. People thought I was crazy. So today you laugh because now we're down to, on Facebook they like bread, so therefore they eat carbs versus they don't eat carbs. So the difference is dramatic. But when I would take the old census data book, it came in a huge book. I mean, huge. And so I would have to actually unentangle it because I had these clips. I mean, y'all can't even imagine. And so it was hard to work with the data. And then I would overlay in this precinct, which overlays with this census tract 90%, 50% of the people take public transit versus 50% don't. So when I was working on a metro referendum, that's how I figured it out. So I'm just saying it was a very unusual. So that's what helped me get a start was my separation of insights into the voters. Okay. To say that, I would say by 93, and the business was growing strong, we had a year where we were aiming to change the face of Houston politics. That was our other statement, was we wanted to change the face of Houston politics. And so we had started with women, elected several white women, and of course Sheila Jackson Lee and others. And then this young man came to us, and his name was Joe Roach, and he was 4 feet tall. He suffered from dwarfism. Now we refer to it as little people. When we ran him in 1993, he was referred to as a dwarf. And everybody said, how can you run this guy for city council? And we said, well, let's talk to him, So we talked to him, and he had us eaten out of his hands after the first meeting. So we did decide to work with him because we determined that he had a sense of humor, and that the only way you could run at his size was to have a sense of humor.
Sure.
And in the same season, Martha Wong, who's Asian American, came to us, and she decided to hop in a race 6 weeks before the election.
Oh, wow.
So all the money and all the downtown crowd and all the big funders were already committed to other candidates in that race. And she decided to stop in and jump in the race at the last minute. So fortunately, she has the Asian community support, because we'd never had an Asian on city council. And so they pour out the money for her. And we do the grassroots and really tackle. But the best thing was, we said, be right, vote Wong. And so people loved it. They just loved it. It also helped that she'd been a principal of an elementary school in the district, so people had known her for years. And but they loved that be right, vote Wong. And we had her, again, today it would feel stereotypical, but then when we were breaking the barrier, it did not feel that way. We had her hand out fortune cookies everywhere she went. And when you broke open the fortune cookie, it said vote for Martha Wong. So that was really exciting. And then we took Joe Roach, who was the dwarf candidate, and instead of hiding or trying to campaign around the fact that he was a dwarf, we decided to turn it into the message, because you can't hide from it. As I would tell him, you can't hide your height. You can't hide your skin color. And, you know, these are things you cannot hide about yourself. So fortunately, actually, he met with all the consultants in town and wound up hiring us because of our theory on how to run him for office. And so we went with Joe Roach, big enough for the job. Yeah. And then we had, you know, everything built around that. Big enough to tackle crime, big enough to support stuff. Yeah, and this is a direct mail piece I designed that compared him to the guy who had been there 30 years. This was the beginning of term limits. Here's the inside where you can see, tough enough to tackle crime, big enough for the job. And a picture of his wife, who was also 3'8". And then big enough to attack government waste. And so, you know, we had in there that Frank Mancuso, who he was running against, had been on council for over 30 years, because pre-term limits, that, you know, Joe Roach, Frank Mancuso served on council longer than a 30-year mortgage. But the best story of my campaign lives, the multitudes of them, comes out of this campaign. And it's a little bit delicate, but I am going to share it because it's funny. So when Joe was running for city council the first time, he managed to get the endorsement of the Carpenters Union. Now, Joe was actually a Republican when we started working with him. But in city council races are nonpartisan, so we whipped around between political philosophies, I would say. We also thought Joe was the right person to be on city council. And so, anyway, just also another evidence of climate change. Back then, our hurricanes tended to come in September and October, maybe late August. And my philosophy was, don't order your yard signs until we're kind of out of the hurricane window. And which makes a lot of sense, because as you can imagine, the last thing you can see is a campaign sign flying through somebody's window. And so I usually wouldn't order them until Labor Day. And but Joe was in a hurry to get his yard signs. So yard signs in the 90s and up to the mid-90s and 80s, 70s, when I was campaigning, were hard work, because you printed the posters, okay, and then you had to buy tomato stakes, these sticks that were long, and then you had to glue and staple to the posts. And, you know, of course, anytime it rained, they melt. It was just not... Today we have those foam core things that are the plastic board that you just stick in the end. Nobody has to... I mean, we had yard sign building parties, right? So with bottles of glue that was one of my jobs with the steel workers, was to oversee the building of yard signs, and electric staplers that ran the things down. I mean, it's just hard work.
We have it so easy nowadays.
You have no idea. And so Joe, we got him his yard sign. The Carpenters Union standard yard sign pole was 4 feet. Not a single person thought of it. Not me, not Keith, not Olga. Nobody thought about the fact that these poles were 4 feet long. and then they were tapered on the end so you could hammer them into the grass. So Joe, I had him 100 yard signs printed pre-Labor Day, and he comes back to the office and he's very, very angry. He and Becky together,
His wife,
and they get out of their big Suburban that they drove, and they take one of the yard signs out, and they have all three of us standing on the front porch, and they held up the yard sign next to Joe. Well, it was his height. Oh. And he said, "We have a problem with these yard signs." They weren't tall enough to hammer them in. I mean, they were too tall for him and Becky, who was 3'8", to hammer them into the ground. So, I mean, to us, that was very funny at the time because, nobody thought about it. The carpenters didn't think about it. We didn't think about it. Joe didn't think about it. They're just a standard 4-foot yard sign. And we had made essentially this picture on his door hanger, the yard sign. And we had put at the bottom of the yard sign actual size. So... because we all had a great sense of humor. So we had to send all the signs back over to the Carpenters Union. The next batch we ordered, we had them cut at 3.5 feet so that Joe and Becky could hammer them in. So I really think that's one of the best stories of my career.
Very
because
unique,
Joe was
for
a very unique candidate.
Yeah.
Very, very unique candidate. And,
Absolutely.
So the great news is that year, 1993, Joe won his election and Martha Wong won her election, as well as several other of our candidates. But the big thing about that was that, the Chronicle, again, back when they had political writers, called us the inside baseball winners, which was a huge boost for our business. And Keith would tell you that after that point, we became more like a boutique. Like you could go shopping at Dillard's, or you could go shopping at, the small personally owned fashion store in River Oaks. And he said the way our clientele began to shift after that, big wins in 93, was that we became the boutique everybody wanted to hire. And we actually learned a lesson ourselves in 96 that we had a cap on how many clients we could serve. And that made us even more boutique because after we lost a couple of races in a big election sweep, we decided that, okay, we can't handle, 14 candidates. We can only handle 8 or something. And so we started telling people no. And the more we told people no, the more they wanted to hire us. So we were peaking at that point.
That's amazing. How has campaigning changed through the course of your career as far as tactics, styles, messaging? You've talked a little bit about the 1993 campaign already. And
sure.
Now certain things have changed. What else has changed?
Well, everything's changed. I mean, everything I started, we would you'd have volunteers working in the headquarters. Like when I was 16, 17, 18, used to volunteer at my state rep's office. I also volunteered on his campaigns. And we had big phone books, big Houston phone books. And you would actually sit there and look up the telephone number so you could build a list for him to call. So now that's all a punch of a button. And it's so sophisticated. We know that this person has voted in the last 3 primary elections or voted in the last 8 City of Houston elections, down to what color shoes they wear. I mean, today you can get all of that data so quickly.
Sure, yeah.
Partially the negative side of that is that you don't have as much for volunteers to do as you used to, because the campaign headquarters used to be like the place to be. And when I was Kathy Whitmire's volunteer coordinator in 83, we had one guy. He brought in the kind of an early version of a computer. I can't really remember what we called it. It had a name, but he started building a database. All of our data on Kathy's donors and supporters were in shoe boxes with index cards. Quite literally, shoe boxes with index cards. And this is how you did it. You actually set the shoe box with index cards in it, and had Kathy call them and ask for money, And you had notes on the cards and stuff, but you couldn't keep the data like we do now. And so, he started to build our data list, and he could print out. This guy was a NASA engineer, by the way. And he would come in, he'd bring his, whatever that early version was, and he could print out labels. So you printed them out on what was called a dot matrix printer. And they were very complicated. And so, anyway, then I'd have 200 volunteers come in that night, and they'd set up, and we'd have labels parties. So you would stick the label onto the envelope, you'd sit and pass it down, and another person, we had these bottles with rubber things on the end, you'd seal the envelope with water, and then the next person would stamp it. So you had the label, we called them the 4S parties: sealing, stamping, stuffing, whatever it was. And I would have 200 volunteers a night to process the direct mail. Wow. And then I personally, usually with one volunteer, would take the bulk mail bags down to the post office docks by myself. I would carry these huge gray bags of mail. And this was the election where the police, the idea that Kathy Whitmire looked like Tootsie was emerging. And it was very insulting for her. She did dress very 80s professional woman, which was not attractive. We were not attractive in the 80s. And because we tried to dress like men. That's really when the first wave of women fully entered the workforce. And we tried to dress like men. We wore suits, and we wore these collars, and we wore bow ties. And, if you wore anything less than that, you were asking for it, maybe. And so, Kathy looked like that. She had these huge glasses on her small face. And anyway, so the police started this Toot Toot Tootsie Goodbye, which was named after an old song. It's called Toot Toot Tootsie Goodbye. And, a lot of people knew it at that time frame. And so I was so mad at the police they were putting these stickers on their police cars, which is blatantly illegal, but they didn't say vote for Kathy Whitmire. They said Toot Toot Tootsie Goodbye. So I took the Toot Toot Tootsie Goodbye, got very angry. One night I sketched out of course you would sketch out.
Sure.
You would sketch out a bumper sticker. And I sketched out Tootsies on a roll, and I put it in the form of a Tootsie Roll. So it took a few days to get those printed, and we got them printed, and we started handing out Tootsie Rolls with Kathy on the campaign trail. So the way I'd get my mail moved quickly was I'd go down to the bulk mail dock, pull up my little car, whatever it was, and unload these bags, and postal workers be fussing at me. It'd be midnight, and I'd say, I brought Tootsie Rolls, and my mail would hit the next day.
Nice.
It was very funny. So you think today none of that happens. It's all electronic. So I don't know what you have volunteers do, really.
Fundraise, mostly, probably.
And block walk.
Yeah,
They put them on block walks. But, the days where the headquarters was like a big family gathering spot have really changed. And everything's gone electronic. So, there's so much good about that. But then I wonder sometimes if we haven't gotten to the point that we target voters so tightly that we miss really understanding them. Yeah. Because, for example, you could be somebody who voted in Democratic primaries 3 in a row. And then one year you decide to vote in the Republican primary for some reason. And all of a sudden you're on all the Republican mailing lists, and the Dems have dropped you. Well, I don't know that I would drop that Dem, right? So you can see where the computers get it so tight that it's beautiful in concept. But I also think direct mail is fading a little bit, and you're seeing such an increase in social media advertising, and social media has transformed everything.
Absolutely, yeah.
Especially because your whole life is portrayed there.
Yeah. Well, voluntarily, we put it up there voluntarily.
Exactly.
What about messaging, like slogans? Do they really matter anymore? Or,
I think a good slogan still matters, and I'm shocked by how we've gone away from the humor and the fun of politics, like doing Joe Roach and
big enough for the job.
Yeah, and these Martha Wong, they were great campaigns, and we always prided ourselves on being able to present a good message and message strategy. But it's become a bit more bogged down, I think. Not as simple, not as straightforward. It's challenging these days.
Yeah.
But I tell you, if you give people something easy to remember, they will stay with it.
Yeah.
In fact, Sally Alcorn, who just ran for Houston City Council 2019, hers was one of the best I'd seen in a while. She ran under Sally for the City.
Oh.
So kind of playing off of, Sex in the City.
Yeah,
and,
for sure.
and just, Sally for the City. It was simple. It stuck in your brain. And I haven't seen as much of that lately.
So yeah, so slogans still matter, but not as much as they did before when
She won handily.
Yeah. Well, there you
I'm
go.
Just saying.
That's fantastic. That's great. I wanted to talk a little bit about your experience here at the University of Houston as a professor here. So you've been teaching Women in Politics course for
About 18 years.
18 years. What do you find most striking about teaching this course now versus what it was when you began teaching it?
That is such a great question. First off, let me say I never get bored teaching that class because, in fact, one of the department chairs asked me, "Aren't you tired of teaching that class?" I was like, "How could you be tired of it? It rewrites itself every single time you teach it." I mean, I teach it in the fall only, so I used to teach it both semesters and it would sell out, but then they decided it should go to once. And so, I mean, since I last taught it, Kamala Harris has become vice president, right? So, and last semester when I taught it, there were enough women candidates around the country that my 40 students could pick a female candidate and follow their campaign. I could never have given that assignment in the beginning. But probably one of the biggest places I've seen a huge difference is I do this section on women and money and when women learn to manage money. And then I always ask, who manages the money in your household? And when I first started teaching this class, it was overwhelmingly the men managed the money. And now it's really the opposite. That it's 2/3 they say their moms manage the money, and a lot of moms as breadwinners, much less of a traditional perspective of the dad as the breadwinner and bill payer, right? So it's very interesting to have seen that change. I kind of wish I'd been like Dr. Kleinberg over at Rice and started studying it, but I wasn't that smart. But so many changes also in access to the workplace. And I've actually come to determine, again, without fully supportive data, that the glass ceilings moved up to about 35 to 40. And you won't necessarily hit it now when you first hit the workplace. You will hit it as you progress in the workplace. Whereas when my age, you had to shatter the glass. There wasn't even an opening. You had to break through it
just to get in.
Just to get in.
So nowadays,
now there's a ceiling and it's raised up a little bit.
So it's up to a certain point.
One thing has not changed is the view of woman as vessel. So if a company is looking at hiring you or your college buddy, and you walk in with a big engagement ring on your finger, and you both have the same qualifications, who are you going to invest in? Well, I'm going to invest in the guy because the woman is telling me she's about to get pregnant within 2 years. So why do I want to invest all that money on training, etc.? And I know people will push back on me. I'm showing this is how it is. I have watched it happen in the corporate world. And so you can be mad at me if you want, but it's a fact. So we still view woman as vessel. And companies still say, especially smaller, I won't say your large corporate, it has gotten better. They give 3 months maternity leave, etc. But when they're looking at investing in the younger person, they are going to question, and they're not allowed to ask, when do you plan to have children? They're not allowed to ask that in the interview. And so they're going to presume. So I actually advise students not to wear engagement rings to interviews.
Interesting, right. Well, it already kind of creates a bias there.
It does create. So they hire the guy because they think, I'm going to spend 2 years training this person to get them to where I want them to be, and then they're gonna have a baby and maybe or maybe not come back. That's what women fought for. This is an ongoing debate in my women in politics class still to this day. Feminist and the women's liberation movement in the 70s was about fighting for your right to do what you chose. You should not hate people because they choose to be stay at home.
Right.
You should not hate people because they choose the career path. And I remember when my child was looking at daycare, I was looking to put my child into daycare. And I quite literally asked the proportion of working mothers, because there was a culture that if you were a working mother and your child stayed to the 6 p.m., and my child's just turning 20, so we're talking in the last 20 years. So.
Wow, very interesting. What is kind of the breakdown of your students? Like, is it mostly those who identify as female, or is there a lot of interest?
So it varies. It has between 1/3 to 1/2 male. Almost every semester. At least a third is male. And that happens from the other classes I teach. So I'm very lucky that I have my own little recruitment mechanism.
Sure.
And I talk the guys into taking the
women politics course.
And I think it's important because we need men we need to hear men's opinions. And I find that some of my male students are more feminist than some of my female students.
Very interesting. What other classes do you teach?
They vary, but I teach political campaign marketing, which is basically, for me, it's how to write a campaign plan. Gotcha. And I teach every so often. This year, the legislature's in session, so I'm teaching the theory and practice of lobbying.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. That's great. If we can keep talking about women in politics, of course,
Endlessly.
Endlessly. But I would like to kind of talk a little bit about your collection here in Special Collections. In 2019, you've donated your collection to the University of Houston Library Special Collections. What inspired you to donate, and in what ways do you hope your collection will help student success?
Well, it's always hard to talk about yourself a little bit. And, of course, my whole career has been promoting others. I don't know if you see that pattern in it, but it has always been about telling the stories of others. And when I finished my master's, I did a stint in Ireland at a small college outside of Limerick that had I did a thesis on Irish women feminists. Essentially, that Ireland wasn't the biased state, country that many people thought it was. So anyway, and I found these original handwritten minutes of their suffragist meetings, from the early 1900s and 1800s. And, it was amazing. And I had to handle them with gloves and all that. But I spent hours with this librarian on this thesis. And I was just amazed at what had been maintained. So when I came back, and Dr. Gregory and I knew each other, and I had already been working with Kathy Whitmire to get her campaign papers donated to U of H. She left her city papers to the Julia Idison Library, but I worked with her. We're still friends. I needed something out of her collection last week for a reporter, and she texted me and said, "Hey, can you help with it?" So we actually are still very good friends. But I asked her to donate all of that, and I think you see one of the scrapbooks there is Kathy. So I'd asked her to donate her papers. I had asked one of the Houston Post political writers to donate her papers. And I had started telling everybody I know, there's a women's archive at U of H Library, and we really got to put stuff in it. Our stories are not told. And, my whole Women in Politics course is about learning about women you've never heard of. And that's why I call it her story, because his story deletes the role of women. It just does. And that's history, right? And as we know, it's also written by the winners.
Yeah.
That's why we get the veiled versions of it that we do. Yeah. So one day a friend called me and said, my friend has some stuff you might want for that archive. And I was so excited. No, actually I wasn't excited. I was kind of tired because I picked up a lot of bug-infested stuff, and I had kind of gotten, okay, I need to know more about what's in it. So I meet her friend at the park, and she gives me this garbage bag, which I go, oh no, here comes another garbage bag. But in fact, inside it was the entire first year of Ms. Magazine in pristine condition, preserved in individual baggies. Wow. So that was I think, beyond Kathy's stuff, that was one of my biggest wins for the library. And I tell my students to come over and look at it, because we do a whole section on the 70s, what it meant for women in America. And so anyway, and then I was packing up, downsized my life because my daughter was going to college. And I was starting to clean out my house, and I was like, what do you do with all this stuff? And then I sent Dr. Gregory a note, and I said, who's over women's studies, by the way. And I said, do you think anybody would be interested in my stuff for the archives? And she was like, do I need to slap you or what? And so I did start gathering it up, putting it in boxes, which you've been living with, I'm sad to say. And but what I hope people learn is the difference that women made in campaigns, and how having women involved also helped women get elected, and how they can look at how we campaigned. I mean, this is an incredible piece I have laying here. This was a woman that I ran for state rep 90 and 92. It was one of my earliest clients, and her opponents started mudslinging at her and attacked her family, which this was a race over in West U, Bel Air. You don't really attack families over there. It's not a big...
Like physically?
But we used this picture on all our campaign literature, which was the dad, the mom, and her children. In fact, her daughter, sitting right here in the Suburban, is currently chair of the Democratic Party. That's when I always tease people when I say I've known Lily since she was little. I'm not kidding.
Yeah, there you go.
But he attacked her, and this was also a new technique in direct mail. Michael Fry, who was a cartoonist here in Houston, and it did cartoons for the Chronicle. There's also a Joe Roach card done by him. He has actually become so famous. He was a part of the movie, I think it was called The Suburbs or something, that was animated about all the animals that lived. Anyway, he became a very famous cartoonist and artist, and etc. But this was a new technology where I could blend a printed picture with a drawn cartoon. So I had Michael Fry drop the cartoon, and we did this mudslinging piece. And says, look out, in the remaining days of this campaign, you will hear many untruths and false statements. And we said, if you hear rumors or see votes that make you uncomfortable, I want you to personally call me, and let me discuss it with you. You don't see much of that anymore. But, and then we had the universal no sign with negative campaigning. And she won by 300 votes.
Wow.
And we believe, to this day, you cannot convince me it wasn't this card that helped her win.
Because of this.
Yeah, because he was really going after her. And so, anyway, I just think that's,
that's an
you've
amazing
seen
story.
how it's changed to have women campaign.
Absolutely.
Yeah. By the way, you might want to mention the sheriff's deputy. And
Okay.
the fact that I was a sheriff's deputy.
Let's talk about
I
that.
don't know
Let's
if you
talk
can
about
get that.
the time you were a sheriff's deputy.
Yeah, so what happened was when I went to work for my state legislator, I was about 21, 22, and he thought I had a bad attitudes towards police officers.
Oh.
And probably didn't. I mean, we in the late 70s, early 80s didn't like police, just like a lot of people don't like them today. Mm-hmm. And so he thought I had a bad attitude, and he carried the police bill of rights every session. Mm-hmm. So he called up the sheriff and said, I need my staffer to go to the sheriff's academy so she can learn more about policing. Let me tell you something. This is 1982. There were hardly any women in law enforcement. And there were 3 women in my class at the sheriff's academy. And the sergeant had it out for me.
Oh.
And you see how fair-skinned I am. For example, he made me lay in an ant bed to pursue a suspect. I mean, you wouldn't get away with that today. No, he couldn't do that today. I got sunburned, and I'm violently allergic to red ants, as you can imagine with my coloring. And he made me lay there in an ant bed and wouldn't let me get up. You know, finally, one of the guys just came and said, "You got to get up," you know, because I was welting, you know, literally getting welts. And so he was very mean to me, the sergeant, and he was determined to flunk me out, which only made me determined to pass. Because telling me no in those days was like saying, go do it.
Yeah.
If anybody said you can't do it, it was an invitation for me to try.
It's a great attitude to have.
So I got through that sheriff's academy and got my badge and, you know, was a licensed peace officer for the state of Texas and learned a lot about law enforcement. It did help me have more respect.
Yeah.
And it did, and it was really unique. And I guess 3 women graduated the Sheriff's Academy that year.
So overall, it was a good experience.
It was probably one of the toughest things I've ever done. But, you know, I got through it, and my attitude improved, and I learned a lot.
So it was positive
And I
outcome.
carried my badge. I was a sheriff's deputy for a while.
Yeah, and your ID here as well.
Well,
yeah.
this one, the Houston Police Department used to issue IDs for people that worked for the mayor.
Oh, I
So
see.
if you were in the mayor's office, you would get an ID from the Houston Police Department to say that you. Basically, it was your get out of jail free card, but it didn't work because police hated Kathy Whitmire. So.
All right.
They didn't like her very much.
Oh. Well, are there any other items you'd like to talk about? I know that there's the bronze,
Excalibur.
Yes, the Excalibur.
These are in the PR industry. I won a lot of awards. You know, I transitioned to the private sector after my child was born. I had my child very late in life at 42, and I needed to have a little more stability. I had to close the business, and I needed a more stable environment for child raising.
Sure.
And she was a miracle baby. I'd been told I couldn't have children, and so I think it's important because it's transformative to my career. The fact that, you know, I had a very rare form of female cancer when I was 28, and surgeries and treatment, and I was told after that I would not be able to have children. So I spent my 30s, you know, going out with men who wanted to start a family, you know, and that wasn't going to happen for me. And so finally at 38, I met a guy, and he was like, I'm kind of over that. And so we married at 40, and then 5 months later I turned up pregnant, much to doctors' surprises. And for me, I must say, as a woman, I had a lot of unique experiences with that. One was that I realized that my woman as vessel theory is dead on, because the bigger my belly got, the smaller my brain got. as way people interacted and listened to me. And I'm just dead serious. The way people treat you, both men and women, but especially men. The more you show your pregnancy, the less they want your input. And that's very evident today as much as it was then. And I tell all my young women when they get pregnant, watch for the pregnancy syndrome.
Oh,
you know, and you'll find it to be true. And
there's still a long way to go, huh?
Yeah. And so anyway, in the PR industry, I earned a lot of awards because that's where I transitioned after my child was born. And I wouldn't say I broke a lot of barriers there. I did lead a public affairs practice and build it, but it's a woman-friendly world. And so I won this for a video we made after Hurricane Ike for the Housing Authority. And it was really wonderful. But I made a lot of videos and stuff. So I hope people get out of the collection what the life of a typical, well, maybe not typical, but a woman who started her career in the 80s with the masses of other women and started it in a totally male-dominated field and how she made it through. I would hope that's something people learn, and how we shaped the women candidates for office and women clients that I had and all of that along the way.
Absolutely. And we have a lot of material here that, for anyone who would like to check out Nancy Sims' collection, we have it here at Special Collections. My last question for you, Nancy, is what message do you have for women today, especially those who are interested in politics, in political consulting, or public relations?
I'd say go for it. Go for what. It doesn't matter if you're interested in NASA. Just go for it. Pursue your dream. And I used to have a little sticker. I'm hoping it shows up in one of your files that I picked up at the International Women's Convention in 1977. A little sticker. It sat on my desk for decades. And it said, only she who attempts the impossible can achieve. Sorry. My first goof up.
No problem. You're fine.
Only she who attempts the absurd can achieve the impossible.
Wow.
And I just love that. It speaks to me in so many ways. So if somebody says to you, like I said earlier, you can't do that, tell them they're wrong. My goddaughter wants to major in physics in college, and I'm like, great,
do that.
Don't tell her she shouldn't. And I think that's very important for women. You can pursue whatever you want. You can face the challenges it will offer you, but you can overcome and work your way through them.
Absolutely. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your story. Again, happy Women's Herstory Month. Right?
Yes.
Once again, Nancy Sims' collection is available at Special Collections at the University of Houston. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.